All right, thank you. Hope you enjoyed the lunch break, and we'll just jump right in. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, David Lopez-Salido, who will moderate the next session.
Thank you, Trevor. Thanks, everybody, for coming back in time. We started session number 3 of this conference on monetary policy strategies. As Trevor said, I'm David Lopez-Salido. I'm an economist in the Division of Monetary Affairs here at the Federal Reserve Board. It's really a pleasure and a great honor for me to introduce the 2 speakers that we have for this session. Those are leading macroeconomists from which we'll learn a lot. And so Carl Walsh is a distinguished professor at the University of California in Santa Cruz. Is well known for many contributions to the study of monetary policy that include the design of inflation targeting, optimal monetary policy, and the implications for that of labor market frictions. He has experience as a business scholar in many Federal Reserve banks and other central banks across the world. And he's the author of an internationally used grad textbook, Monetary Policy and Theory, that I studied deeply these years. The discussants will be Ken Rogoff. I think need no introduction. Professor Rogoff is a professor from Harvard, has long experience in policy organizations. He was actually an economist, telling me at the board during 1980 to 84. They moved to academia. He's also former chief economist of the IMF, has many important contributions on domestic and international macroeconomic issues that include his classical analytical contribution in 1985 on central bank independence, and as many other theoretical and empirical studies on international macro and international finance. Is the author of many important books. One of them is a fantastic grad book on international macro with Professor Osfeld, and also as a new book coming out on Our Dollar, Your Problem, an insider view of 7 turbulent decades on global finance. So without further ado, I'm going to give you the floor, Carl, and you have 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me to join in this event today. I was asked to talk about lessons for monetary policy strategy, and there are a lot of lessons, and I'll focus on some that I think are particularly important in terms of thinking about the revisions to the FOMC's statement on longer run goals and monetary policy strategies. Now, a useful place to start is 2012, because that's the year in which the FOMC adopted its first statement on longer run goals and strategy. And if we think of sort of monetary policy lessons circa 2012, I think the most important one was that flexible inflation targeting works. It proved successful in developed and developing economies. And it was quite a simple structure in the sense it involved central bank independence, particularly instrument independence, combined with a clear objective for inflation. And that clear objective for inflation, combined with the ability of the central bank to actually achieve that objective, served to help anchor longer run inflation expectations, and that provided the central bank with the flexibility to respond to macro disturbances and contribute to overall macro stability. Now, in the case of the US, the mandate for the FOMC comes from Congress. In the Federal Reserve Reform Act of 1977, you can see the origins of the mandates in terms of maximum employment, or to promote maximum employment, and to promote price stability. There's also promoting medium long-term interest rates, but that's usually subsumed within the dual mandate of maximum employment and price stability. So the 2012 policy framework provided the operational objectives that translated maximum employment and price stability into operational terms. So it established a 2% target and defined that in terms of a specific price index. So it was a clearly defined operational objective that corresponded to price stability. And that was in part because the statement says that in the longer run, inflation is primarily controlled or influenced by monetary policy. It also said that non-monetary factors are prevalent in determining longer run employment, not monetary policy. So it set an unemployment target that was less clearly defined than the inflation target, but it was linked to something quantitative. It was linked to the FOMC's longer run projection of the unemployment rate in the Survey of Economic Projections. Now, in 2016, that was revised to change the discussion of the target to a symmetric inflation target. And it said that the FOMC would be concerned if inflation were running persistently above or below inflation. Otherwise, the 2% PCE inflation target was not changed. The description of the employment mandate operational objective was not changed. Okay, it's useful to sort of then look at sort of macroeconomics from a very sort of a high-level perspective of looking at inflation relative to 2% and an unemployment rate gap. And here I've used the CBO's estimate of non-cyclical unemployment to form the gap. The FOMC's longer run projection is not available starting back at 2001, where this chart starts. The blue circles, the open circles, are the period leading up to the adoption of the 2012 statement. You can see the high levels of unemployment associated with the global financial crisis and the Great Recession. But the period immediately prior to the adoption of the 2012 revision to the longer run goals and monetary policy strategy statement are indicated in the red diamonds. And almost all of those fall below the zero horizontal line, implying inflation was below 2%. They are also, a lot of the observations are in quadrant 4, where in some sense inflation was too low and unemployment was too high. That would generally suggest that perhaps policy had not been expansionary enough, but that's presumably a signal of the constraint imposed by the effective lower bound. Also, I think the lesson from the red dots, that's not apparent here since they aren't dated, but there was a feeling that the decision to raise interest rates in December of 2015 was a policy mistake. And so going into 2019 and the review that led to the 2020 statement, the Fed wanted to deal with sort of three issues. One, inflation had in fact averaged less than 2%. It averaged the red dots, 1.36%, so it was falling below the longer run target for inflation. Concerns about eliminating or reducing the constraint imposed by the effective lower bound, and dealing with this issue that perhaps in 2015 policy had tightened too soon. So the operational objectives were revised in 2020. So the operational target for inflation became average inflation target when average inflation falls short of 2%, and inflation targeting when it doesn't. So it's sort of a hybrid or asymmetric AIT/IT, and I'll generally write AIT/IT to remind us that there was also an inflation targeting part of it, as well as an average inflation targeting. The operational objective for the employment mandate became the shortfalls of employment from its maximum level. And a third change that doesn't seem to be noted upon quite as frequently as the first two is that the order in which these operational objectives were discussed was reversed. From 2012 up to 2019, the inflation objective was discussed, and then the employment objective was discussed. And in 2020, those were flipped. And I take that as a sense that there was a shift in priorities between the two mandates towards the employment mandate away from the inflation mandate. Okay, what are the pros and cons of these changes? Well, if the asymmetric AIT/IT regime is credible, it raises expected inflation. It's something we've known long time, models from over 20 years ago, that if you have asymmetric preferences over inflation, that's going to weigh responding to low inflation more. The average inflation will rise. And that's going to be, and that was part of the objective because they wanted to more firmly anchor long-run expectations, so they wanted to raise average inflation. And that helps to reduce the impact of the effective lower bound, also one of the objectives they were attempting to achieve. And essentially, AIT works by converting inflation expectations into automatic stabilizers. So if it's credible, expectations will move in a way that helps promote stabilization policy. Now, in the literature, this regime has been studied in two different ways. One is by thinking of it as defining a new sort of inflation variable in an instrument policy rule. So replacing inflation deviations from 2% and putting in average inflation deviations from 2%. And one thing that does, if you're responding to average inflation, it tends to make policy more inertial because you're looking backwards at what inflation had been in the past. And that can be effective or helpful at the zero lower bound where you want to have credible lower for longer policies. Well, under AIT, you're still responding to the low inflation in the past, so it may make more credible your lower for longer policy. Now, the other way to think about policy regimes is defining the objectives of the central bank, not the variables they're responding to, but the objectives or goals that they're trying to achieve. And so if other authors have studied average inflation as a goal, you're minimizing deviations of average inflation from 2% and some employment objective. And that makes policy both more inertial, but it also makes policy more forward-looking. Because even under pure discretion, if you're trying to minimize deviations of average inflation, you have to take into account how your impact on inflation today affects the average going into the future. And that's going to affect private sector expectations as well. So it makes even discretionary policy forward-looking, which can be beneficial. Okay, the advantage of the shortfall approach, well, it allows the economy to run hot. You're not going to respond to unemployment when it falls below your estimate of maximum employment unemployment. And that was also desired because it would produce a more broad-based and more exclusive expansion and reduce the hazard of removing the punch bowl too soon in the old language of the Fed cooling expansions before inflation got out of hand. And it also, this asymmetry in responding to unemployment, works to raise average inflation. So if this all worked as planned, it would help address the issues the Fed was concerned about. So what are the cons? Well, obviously it may not be credible. Uri has just talked about unanchored expectations, and certainly among households, his evidence suggests that they don't understand average inflation targeting. There's some experimental lab evidence that actually finds that long horizon average inflation targeting can lead to destabilizing extrapolative expectations that go in exactly the opposite direction you want. And so understanding how people respond to things like average inflation targeting, I think, is an open question. There's a lack of clarity. The averaging window is left unspecified. It's again sort of goes against the grain of inflation targeting, where one of the prime things was you wanted to give a clear understanding to the public of what you were trying to achieve. This was more reminiscent of the 1970s when Congress mandated that the Fed establish growth rate targets for monetary aggregates, and so the Fed obliged by establishing growth rates for multiple monetary aggregates. And so you didn't really know which one they were paying attention to, and they could usually find one that would hit the target or come close to it. And actually, I don't think that there's any evidence on the performance of an instrument rule that actually captures what the 2020 policy framework did. I've got an example here of one that might. So the capital I's there are index variables. So you have a term that says you respond to average inflation if it's less than 2%. That's the first term. The second term is you respond to inflation if average inflation is greater than 2%. And those response coefficients don't need to be the same. And then the shortfalls part is you respond to the unemployment rate, but only when it's above what I've called U star here, which would be the unemployment rate associated with maximum employment. And so there are a number of papers that analyze shortfall, but just have average inflation targeting for those first two terms, and a lot of ones that analyze average inflation targeting, that is, combine the first two terms and don't have the shortfalls. So there's very little evidence on how a rule like this, that I think more accurately captures the 2020 framework, actually work in models. Okay, what are the cons of the shortfall approach? Well, one thing the 2020 revision did is it changed the language on maximum employment from what had been used, which was that it may not be directly measurable, and they changed that to the more definitive statement that we can't measure it. Okay, so it made it less clear. Now, the point was raised in the earlier session about nonlinear Phillips curves. So if the Phillips curve is nonlinear, maybe it's low unemployment rates that you need to respond more strongly to than higher unemployment rates. Again, not that you wouldn't respond, but the strength of your response might differ. More importantly, I think the way I think about policies is, okay, what's the distortion or the inefficiency that we're trying to address here, and what are the appropriate tools? And so, I think probably most people would agree that a more broad-based, inclusive economic expansion is good, but what really are the distortions that are leading to expansions being less inclusive than is efficient? Or what's the distortion there? And so there's very little literature sort of linking the shortfalls approach to the underlying distortion that we're trying to address here. And then the other question about whether monetary policy is an efficient tool for trying to address those distortions. Just to take an example, our basic models of the new Keynesian framework assume imperfect competition in goods markets. And so in some sense, the natural rate of output is below the efficient level of output. But we don't ask the central bank to deal with that. We don't think of the central bank and monetary policy as an effective tool for addressing that efficiency shortfall. And then also, I think the effects of shortfall approach, shortfall response in models is uncertain. So, the questions you'd want to know is average unemployment reduced by responding to shortfalls? Well, you can find in the literature results that it is reduced, and you can find results that it's left unchanged. Does the probability of the effective lower bound rise or fall? Well, you can get both results in the literature. Does unemployment volatility rise? Maybe, or maybe remains unchanged. Does it increase welfare or reduce it? So depending upon the model, I think the results evaluating a shortfall approach are very uncertain. We just don't know exactly what the consequences might be. Okay, to summarize sort of my impression of the 2020 policy framework, was the new inflation objective clear? No. The asymmetric AIT-IT was confusing, and the averaging window was not specified. Was the employment mandate clear? No. Maximum employment is not directly measurable. So the first paper this morning is very useful in terms of addressing this issue of how you quantify what you mean by maximum employment. And the, one of the advantages of inflation targeting, or one of the objectives of inflation targeting, was to constrain discretionary policy behavior. And so having unclear objectives goes in exactly the opposite direction. If you leave the window unspecified and your employment mandate is not measurable, then there are a whole wide variety of potential outcomes you could use to justify the policy action you undertake. And I think the first lesson I draw also is that, you can pick your inflation target. Okay? So the Fed can pick 2% as the inflation target. It could pick 3% or 1%. But the employment objective is achievable in the longer run only if it picks an operational objective that's consistent with the inflation target. You don't have sort of an independent choice of what your employment objective is going to be. Okay, so now this is the same dot plot as before, but the black squares now represent the observations since the 2020 policy framework was adopted. And you can see most of those fall in quadrant 2, inflation above the target, and the unemployment rate gap negative. If you use the FOMC's long-run projection for unemployment, those black gaps would move a little bit to the right towards the zero line, but basically the same story you would get. Okay? And that's a sign that perhaps over this period policy has been too expansionary. Okay, so the rise in inflation, the quite large rise in inflation we saw in 21, 22, obviously raised issues about whether we were heading back to a great inflation situation. And so I've listed here 5 primary explanations for the great inflation: supply shocks, special factors, the wrong theory of inflation, forecast errors, overestimating potential GDP or underestimating the shock persistence, ambiguous and unachievable objectives, that was central to the sort of time and consistency literature on inflation, and a failure of the Fed to acknowledge its responsibility for inflation. And unfortunately, there were shadows of each of those in the recent years. You know, a lot of talk about supply shocks due to COVID, the war in Ukraine as being the cause of the inflation, a belief that in a flat Phillips curve implying that disinflation would be costly, forecast errors, certainly in underestimating persistence of shocks, and a shift of focus from inflation to running the economy hot. And finally, sort of team transitory, which said it's shocks, we don't have to do anything. And there were hints of all the things that had been pointed to as causes of the great inflation that seemed to be coming into play in 2021, 22, and I think raised legitimate concerns about what would be the consequences. Now, in this chart, the black circles are PCE inflation. The blue diamonds are the unemployment rate gap, now defined with respect to the FOMC's long-run unemployment projection. And the other lines are various measures of average inflation, 2-year, 4-year, 6-year, and 8-year. And the Fed, the vertical line there, the first quarter of 2022 is when the Fed raised the funds rate in March at the end of that quarter. And it sort of met what the Fed had been talking about, and that is hoping to meet its shortfall or its employment mandate before raising the funds rate. And so we see that was the quarter in which the blue diamond drops down to 0. But at that point, inflation itself was approaching 7%. You would normally have expected that the Fed would have responded sooner, but again, they were looking at or emphasizing the employment developments. And if you look at the signals that would have been provided by average inflation targeting, some of the papers in 2019 that analyzed average inflation targeting used 8-year windows, and that's sort of that's the magenta line. And when the Fed raised interest rates in the first quarter of 2022, the 8-year window was still not up to 2%. And so I think this is a suggestion that a long average inflation targeting window is probably too long because it reduces your response to new developments, and it can delay reacting to major shocks. Okay, so what are the consequences of delay? So the FOMC waited before raising interest rates. Now, in almost all our models, we assume that policy responds immediately. They may respond weakly, strongly, with a lot of inertia or not, but as soon as things change, the policy changes, or the policy stance changes. The rule that it may be following calls for a policy action. So Mai Hakamada and I have looked at a case where what happens if you have something like an inflation shock? So we're not trying to model COVID, we just think of a plain inflation shock, and we just focus on what are the consequences of delaying your reaction. So it's a very simple, calibrated new Keynesian model. So here's a response to inflation shock in the standard case. Policy responds immediately, inflation goes up, policy tightens, that causes the unemployment rate to go up, that helps bring down the inflation, and everything converges nicely back to the longer run equilibrium. So what happens instead in this model if the policymaker waits a year before responding? So they hold the interest rate constant for a year, and then they respond. Well, here's the path of inflation and the output gap. So it amplifies the increase in inflation, but it creates an economic boom, Why? Well, this is a rational expectations equilibrium. The large rise and persistent rise in inflation when the interest rate is held fixed reduces the real interest rate. It tends to boost aggregate demand. The economy expands, unemployment falls, but that exacerbates the rise in inflation. Eventually, this is after 4 quarters, the policymaker does respond. They have to raise interest rates much more because inflation has risen much more. So they tighten, and so unemployment then rises. It actually peaks a little bit higher and eventually dies down. Again, long-term expectations are still anchored throughout this. It's a rational expectations equilibrium, but not doing anything affects inflation just as doing something can affect inflation. Now, another perspective on this is to look at the price level. I think we've come to appreciate maybe that people care a lot more about the price level than we anticipated. And so one of the trade-offs faced here is the black line again is you respond immediately. Price level doesn't go up as much, but the cumulative excess unemployment is much larger. So you have a higher cost in terms of unemployment, but there's a smaller impact on the price level compared to the red line where you delay, and there's a much larger increase in the price level. So even when this is a pure supply shock, not responding has an impact as well as responding. So we do some stuff. You obviously have to decide how do you want to weigh those different things. What sort of metric do you use to decide which policy is better? We do find that policy aggression is appropriate if you have weighted. And that's what the FOMC did when the FOMC started raising interest rates. I think the first rise was 25 basis points, but then they started doing much larger rises so that aggression can sort of compensate for delay to some extent. It can help you get back. And policy aggression can be particularly important if the unemployment rate associated with maximum employment is less than the natural rate when there's a sort of a permanent distortion there. Okay, lesson 2, inflation depends on what the central bank doesn't do as well as what it does do. If policy is behind the curve, response needs to be more aggressive. And don't be trapped by forward guidance. Several authors have argued that the delay was due to the forward guidance the Fed had provided. It's important to remember that under an optimal commitment policy, you give forward guidance, but if circumstances change, you modify that because it's a contingent promise. It may be difficult to ensure that people understand that when you give that guidance, it's a contingent promise. It's based on certain assumptions about how the economy is going to evolve. If things start changing, then that guidance will need to adjust. Okay, now, I characterize what the Fed did was take a gamble in delaying, and a gamble in not responding to the inflation shocks more quickly. The gamble was that longer-run inflation expectations would remain anchored, and also that medium-term or short-run expectations would remain anchored. And Uri has emphasized the role of short-run expectations. Because without a policy response, so if you're just holding the interest rate fixed, there are multiple possible paths that return inflation to target, all of which assume longer-run expectations remain firmly anchored, while short-term, medium-term expectations do not. So I take a very simple stripped-down new Keynesian model just to illustrate this in a sort of finger exercises. So the black line is the shock. There's a demand. This is a demand shock. So the demand shock, positive demand shock for 4 quarters, then it goes back to 0. Okay, very simple. The 2 dashed line is the 2% target. The blue line is the standard rational expectations equilibrium. Inflation jumps up. It comes back in period 5. The shock's gone away. Inflation's back to 2%. And life goes on. You stay there. But that's not the only equilibrium. The black path and the red path are also consistent equilibriums in the sense they're consistent with exactly the same shock and exactly the same path for the policy interest rate. The only difference is that in the black line, the public expects that inflation is going to come back to 3% at the end of the shock. And in the red line, they think it's going to come back to 4% at the end of the shock. those three paths all solve the exact same equations in the model, and they differ only by what we assume about expectations after the shock has gone away. And you can see in the black and the red line that inflation becomes much more persistent because of this sort of unanchoring of short-run expectations. Okay, and so it was sort of a gamble that the Fed took that we'd be on the blue line. And, you know, I think it was a dangerous gamble because here's the 1 year, or this is based on the 1 year inflation expectations from the New York Fed, the distribution across households. We can see that in January of 2022, over 70% of households thought inflation would be greater than 4% over the following year. Hopefully it's not just coincidental that that starts dropping quite dramatically when the Fed did finally respond in March of 2022. And so, you know, if they hadn't responded, who knows what would have happened. Okay, so a lack of policy response leads short-term and medium-term expectations to move with actual inflation. And this implies the effects on inflation might be longer lasting and eventually risk de-anchoring longer-run expectations. And I think an important moment was when Chairman Powell at Jackson Hole in 2022 made it clear that price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve and serves as the bedrock of our economy. We will keep at it until we are confident the job is done. And I think that sort of message is very strong to emphasize that the Fed is focused on inflation. Okay, and then again, here's a recent, another picture of household inflation expectations where that Michigan response really shows up, but the New York Fed surveyed consumer expectations, 1 year expectations, sort of look like they're inching up. And so maybe we're not, maybe the gamble hasn't been resolved just yet. Okay, now there are some old lessons that I think it's useful to be reminded of. I surveyed a lot of these at a Jackson Hole paper in 2003. It seems to be the case that if you want a robust policy, you should overestimate the persistence of shocks. That was a problem in the 1970s. The Fed underestimated the persistence of shocks. It was also the case in the recent inflation surge. There's lots of uncertainty about what the persistence of the shocks will be, but you may get a more robust response if you sort of pretend they're going to be more persistent than maybe in your heart of hearts you really believe. The same applies to endogenous persistence. A paper by Levin and Williams many years ago showed that backward-looking models are more difficult to control than forward-looking models, and you can get more robust policies if you sort of assume things are more backward-looking than maybe you really believe. And that's another thing in running scenarios and evaluating alternative policies is useful to keep in mind. And then finally, another reminder of the Hansen-Sargent work on the beware the evil agent, that there's an evil agent out there that's going to try to make you look as bad as possible. And so what's an evil agent going to do? It's going to hit you with a supply shock just when you're already trying to balance inflation and employment objectives. And so you have to be prepared for that. Okay, and lots of new challenges. Don't need to list those. I think everybody has their list. So lesson 5, policy framework should be robust to changes in the economic environment, employ scenario analysis and stress test proposed policy frameworks. And remember, objectives are often not complementary. The policy statement tends to emphasize the complementarity of objectives. They're often not. Making trade-offs is tough when they're not complementary. Avoid lexicographic preferences where you elevate one objective over the others. And also avoid mission creep. I discuss this more in the paper, that if we're going to assign the Fed broader responsibilities, including making sure that expansions are inclusionary, that we need to better understand the distortions involved that we're trying to address and whether monetary policy is an effective tool for addressing them. Okay, so let me just close with a picture that, and I have to attribute this to John Cochran. I first saw it at a Hoover conference a year or two ago. So here's the 1970s Great Inflation. It starts January 70. The horizontal axis counts months since the beginning of the inflation. We see the two big spikes associated with oil price disruptions. And now picture yourself in 1976, that's at 80 months there. Inflation has come down quite dramatically from the peak. You may be thinking, I'm out of the woods. Inflation is still, by today's standards, too high, but it looks like the worst is over. And then you get this other big shock, okay? Now here's the recent inflation. It looks kind of similar. It's a lower level because inflation had been anchored successfully down at lower levels. And now we're sitting down there at the trough, and will the next 12 months keep us down there, or could we have other shocks that might push us up in a repeat of the 70s? So, bad news for the members of the FOMC. I'm afraid your job is not over, and more shocks may be in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl, for this presentation. Can log off 15 minutes to discuss it.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure, first of all, to be here. I was also discussing in 2019. I'll maybe come back to that. And the first thing to say is it's just an incredibly sweeping paper, really encyclopedic, and I don't know how you read all those papers, Carl. It's incredibly concise. Carl, of course, is the author of one of the great graduate textbooks on central banking. Many of you have seen it, and you can sort of see this clarity and organization coming through it. I describe it as a master class in central banking. And it covers different kinds of models, different kinds of empirical approaches, has some important history, and also takes into account credibility issues, which are often ignored. It is quite understated. You heard it sort of through his comments, and I will take it my job as the discussant to bring this out. If I ask, what purpose will the paper serve, I think it's very important to sort of mark what we were thinking in 2025. Maybe we'll, nail it this time on the policy framework, we being the Federal Reserve. Maybe we won't. But I think it's a pretty good representation of what people were thinking, and not to forget that. And I'm going to come back to what people might have been thinking in 2019. So he goes over a lot of the recent literature where people are particularly trying to deal with the zero lower bound and what are different approaches, and talks about average inflation targeting and asymmetric average inflation targeting. One place I think where there really has been quite an advance now for a long time is in new Keynesian models, the ability to capture many things. One thing you can do credibility in a much more interesting way because they endogenously capture what problems you might have with inflation. Now, a theme Carl picks up quite a bit, and it's come up again and again in this discussion, is the struggles of having a dual mandate when inflation you kind of measure, but maximum employment, full employment you don't. It's difficult to estimate. And that just presents challenges and how to deal with it. He spent some time comparing the 2020s with the 1970s. He talked about that at the end. But I think an interesting comment he made about the 2020 framework was it somewhat flipped inflation and unemployment in the relative importance. If you were doing an honest assessment of what the economics profession was thinking at the time, that's what they were thinking. So actually, there's another survey one can find of AEA members from 2020, 2021, and some intermediate years, and ask them, what should the Federal Reserve be doing? And so in 2000, I might get the number right, but something like 75, 80% said inflation, and then their secondary targets like unemployment, et cetera. Same question, I don't know who the 20% who weren't thinking it was inflation are, but it's the American Economic Association. And it's flipped in 2021. Nobody thought the Federal Reserve should be concentrating on inflation. And in my experience, that was very much where the profession was. They just didn't think it would happen. And I can certainly say in teaching, trying to tell people that they should be studying inflation, and maybe fewer of you are young enough to be taking courses at this time, I would teach it, the students would listen patiently, and it was like I was telling them to listen to Frank Sinatra, the music of another generation. And people will say things, you know you heard it. It can't happen in the 21st century. The internet makes it impossible, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So but I think it's important to put in context, you know, the pressures that were coming in on the Fed and setting up this framework. And again, I think, you know, Carl's paper is very much where we are today. Now, he is, I think it's even a little understated to say a robust critique of the Fed's response in 2021, 2022, and he had to do that for his professional credibility. And I think it's welcome that the Fed has that as this is a central paper at this conference of let's, you know, admit something went wrong. And I'll first say what Carl had to say about it, which is he, you know, basically goes through a lot of models and different ways of looking at things and said almost no matter how you look at it, you should have raised interest rates faster. And he mentions the Taylor rule, for example. And I think there are a lot of qualifications one could nitpick. The Taylor rule depends on having an R star, which was moving all over the place and still is. But he considers a lot of things, other rationales for the slow response, and he talked about the consequences of delay. That's a theme that's come up already again and again to move very quickly afterwards. And then he's pretty tough. This is on the mission creep, talking about inclusive expansions where it's hard to know how to interpret that. I'm going to give a little more generous interpretation because I know what I was thinking and what I was saying at the time. And I do feel there's a certain amount of Monday morning quarterbacking to we economists coming in and saying, what should they have done? Start with the pandemic. There are some very nice papers on this to which some of the people here contributed, but was it more a demand shock or a supply shock? Was it a demand shock and a supply shock? It's very fundamental to thinking about how you react to it. And we have gained knowledge partly because we understand the virus better than we did. I think it was very unclear deep into it that there wasn't another leg down and something else going on. What about the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Did we know that was going to end in a stalemate? Did we know Russia wouldn't use at least a tactical nuclear weapon, at some point? I didn't. And so I think, you have to kind of understand this uncertainty, and especially to say we need to be tough on inflation. Let's go back to the last crisis where the whole lesson was we don't need to be tough on inflation. The ECB got in a lot of trouble for raising interest rates, epsilon at one point, trying to fight things. I won't name the person, but you can look it up. I mean, there was a very smart Fed member who was commenting the day after Lehman, we've got to prevent inflation from getting out of control. And I was like, who knew what, exactly what was going to unfold? I would use a chess analogy, if you forgive me, where when I was a young player, full of myself, I'm probably still full of myself, but there was a young chess player. I thought, I would see Bobby Fischer, he was maybe the greatest player of all time, beat somebody where they would make a mistake on move 32, and I would think, they're idiots, I could beat them. And then you play them and realize you're not getting to move 12. I mean, there's many steps, there are many decisions, and you can kind of focus in on one thing, that you did wrong. And I would just want to pick up on a theme I'm going to come to more in a second, but Mark has this wonderful paper with Jordi Galli and Rich Clarida, The Science of Monetary Policy. There's also the art of monetary policy. There are just a lot of unknowns that make it difficult. So let me pick up on some of Carl's conclusions and just highlight some of them. And I think one of the first one kind of makes a lot of sense. When policy gets behind the curve, it needs to move faster. Yuri said that earlier. A lot of people have had that. Okay, got Ben sitting here. I don't want to get in a long debate on forward guidance, but there's sort of a question in the literature about who's listening to the forward guidance besides the Fed, and does it constrain people? Mission creep's been much criticized. My last slide will speak to this, but you want to be an independent institution, you've got to bend with the wind. And the idea that the Fed is completely independent, and if everybody's criticizing, they're not paying enough attention to the environment, to inequality, to social justice, and you want to stay independent, and you want to keep monetary policy independent, it's not so easy. I mean, Kevin Warsh wrote about, spoke about this recently. But on the other hand, it is true. If you have mission creep, do something where it's really making it more difficult. And arguably, the inclusive expansions is pretty vague of what that means. But it was written at a time when no one thought inflation was going to happen. I will just mention, since I'm here, I think when I spoke in 2019 and I was told I was invited, we appreciate your work on negative interest rates. Please don't say anything about it at the conference. I might have said something in passing. And I personally believe, think it's very hard to predict the path of real interest rates. In our star, you can look at one of my recent AER paper with Paul Schmelzing and Barbara Rossi, where we show it's very volatile long-term real interest rates. We probably never should have thought they would always stay zero after the financial crisis. But if you did think they were always going down, I think there's really you need a better tool. We heard earlier, Yuri, in the survey, maybe Carol Corrado said only 20% of people believe that they have the tools. That's probably correct. I think that's actually right. And we need to, I don't think anyone's done negative interest rates in the right way, and you don't have to get rid of cash, and it's something to think about. Okay, I said it. So clearly, the elephant in the room here is central bank independence. If you're preserving central bank independence, and I don't just say this now, I've been saying this for a long time, I mean, that's really the core of doing a good job. If you preserve central bank independence, you can make mistakes, you can come back from your mistakes. And I think something Carl does very well in this paper, again, in a very understated, subtle way, is remind us that the pressures on central banks might have been in remission, but they've come back. There's a lot of papers which just ignore this now because we didn't seem to have any inflation. And I think it's something that's very important. It's very hard for the central bank, any central bank, to be an island of technocratic competence in a sea of political turbulence. You just have to think about that. And just as an example, maybe people become anchored about inflation expectations. I wouldn't count on them being anchored about interest rate expectations and fiscal policy expectations in the current environment. I won't even mention tariff policy, but you're not alone. You're operating inside this larger environment. So I do think having an independent central bank's the most important and effective solution on average to getting low and stable inflation. I will say when I did my 1985 paper in the QJ, which I wrote in 1982, it took me forever to get it published. I got it rejected at every journal with a typical comment being, this is just a veil. Who believes this? You know, they're not really independent. We can debate that, but I think it has been very effective. And I think in designing the monetary framework, we need also to think about robustness, not just to a supply shock or demand shock, but this larger turbulence, which I think calls for having pretty simple things that you're trying to stick to and hang on to. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. I think my impression is this is fantastic, and we have a lot of possibilities to exchange views with the two panelists in the next 30 minutes. So I'm going to give you you want to have a few minutes to.
So let me just
Talk on some
make
of
a
the
couple
points.
of comments. One is,
The mic.
thank you. Let me just make a couple of comments. You know, I really agree with the points that Ken made. Just note that back in 1999, right after the Clara Galli-Gertler famous paper on the science of monetary policy came out, I wrote a piece, an economic letter for the San Francisco Fed called The Art and Science of Monetary Policy. So I fully agree, you know, our models give us the science, but that can't be all. There's an art aspect of understanding how what the data mean, how they're coming in, and how you put it together to blend them with the preferences, the objectives you're trying to achieve. And with respect to mission creep, you know, I wrote with Federico Ravenna a number of papers involving search and matching models of the labor market and new Keynesian frameworks. And when I started that research agenda, I thought it was going to help me understand better why the Fed should focus more on the real economy. And Jim Bullard gave a talk at the Ford Foundation that focused on one of our papers, and his title of his talk was The Unpleasant Arithmetic of Unemployment Targeting, I think, because it turned out the models suggested monetary policy was just not an effective tool for addressing the fundamental distortions in the labor market. So I think with all expansions of the objective, the important thing is to be able to be clear about what it is you're trying to address. And so some things like climate change, I mean, it clearly carries financial risks, and financial institutions need to be aware of those risks, and that falls under the Fed's, within the venue of the Fed in thinking about how climate risks affect the strength and fragility of the financial markets. You know, our labor market distortion is more like imperfect competition in the goods market, where that reduces the natural rate relative to the efficient level, but we don't think the central bank can really do much about that. And so being clear about which extensions of the mission make sense is very important. And I think that's part of the legacy of inflation targeting. You want to be clear about what the objectives are and why you're pursuing them.
Thank you. I'm going to open the floor now for questions. I can't believe there are no questions. Yes. Right here, please. Here, Julia.
So I want to sort of object to the description of the expansion of the full employment mandate as mission creep, or to you know, say that monetary policy is an imperfect tool for addressing, you know, distortions. I think, like, if we zoom back out to the historical perspective, you know, the central banks were created in the aftermath of financial crises to serve the public interest. The dual mandate was added legislatively through a democratic process to hold the central bank accountable for that outcome. So it is part of the Fed's mandate to serve the public interest. It doesn't have to be the perfect tool or the only tool. it is part of the mandate. It is not mission creep to explore the ways that it can achieve that or the trade-offs that it faces. I think Aishigel's work is an important step forward in connecting them and thinking through the dynamics and the trade-offs in real time. But you know, there's this sort of implied criticism of the Fed's framework review last time that, you know, it was sort of looking in the rearview mirror at a zero lower bound episode. But I think that critique of describing it as mission creep is also subject to the potential danger of looking in the rearview mirror. Conditions change. We need a dynamic framework to explore the interactions and the trade-offs between the dual mandates. That doesn't always mean leaning one way. It means exploring those trade-offs in real time in a sensible way, but in no way throwing that mandate under the bus. Just, that's my own thought.
Yes, here, Larry Mayer.
Let me say boldly, there's no AIT in fate. Absolutely not. Notwithstanding half a sentence in the strategy statement that we're doing average inflation targeting, cross that out, take the second half of the sentence. What they promise to do is, after persistent undershooting, to overshoot modestly and for some time, okay? This is simply lower for longer, okay? What they promised to do before, that's all it is, lower for longer. Don't confuse it by calling it average inflation target. There's no identification of a cumulative shortfall, no rule for how to get it back, okay? It just isn't fit.
I'm going to collect other questions. Joe Kahn.
Thank you. Joe Gagnon, Peterson. I worry that COVID inflation was not seen by the profession for some good reasons and some bad reasons, and we could learn something about that. I've actually written on that too, but it seems to me that we don't want to put too much weight on a once-in-a-century shock when designing our framework. So it seems to me before COVID, we had learned some lessons, and I think they still may be valid in the future. So I want to align myself very much with what Chair Powell said this morning, and based on his speech in 2018 on the stars of monetary policy, we need to have some humility as to where the stars are when we're designing policy. And I think exploring the idea of maximum employment and pushing you down to see how far you can go without causing inflation was exactly the right thing to do at that time. We just have to have some humility. We want maximum employment, not stabilized employment. We want the maximum employment. So I think that's important. That's what the law says. It doesn't say stabilized employment. It says maximum employment. And I think we saw this morning that if one reason I think that this was a problem is when we do, for example, there's many things that can go wrong, but one is if we have a linear Phillips curve and we estimate U star, we're going to be biased. It's going to be, the estimates are going to be too high. That's very easy to show. We saw that, I believe, in the paper this morning. And so that's why just aiming for U star isn't good enough. We want to see if we can do better because we have a reason to think we may actually have the wrong estimate of U star. We shouldn't forget that.
Before, I'm going to collect another questions in the back before you answer that.
You focused heavily on strategies regarding the policy rate, emphasizing the need to be robust and nimble and to not be trapped by your own forward guidance. But I was wondering about the implications for balance sheet policies, in particular QE, which is inherently a less nimble tool. What are the implications for QE strategies? Thanks.
Thank you. So, Carl, Ken.
So on the mission creep, I guess that was a bad term to use. It was meant to be, not meant to indicate that you don't want to try to explore what is the maximum employment level. I'm really concerned about saying, well, we have this mandate, but we can't measure it. Not that it's hard to measure, but we can't measure it. And that's one of the purposes of objectives, like the inflation target, quantifying it, is to serve as a performance measure. How do we know, how can the public understand whether the central bank is sort of doing what we want it to do? And we don't ask the central bank to maximize social welfare. That's what we do in the models. But we want them to have operational objectives that allow people to understand whether they're performing well. And we have a theory of index numbers and various price indices we can choose from, but it's important to focus on one so people have a reference point. And you need something similar with respect to the unemployment rate or the employment rate that is going to correspond to whether you're successful in meeting that employment mandate. I think the issue of Joe's point is that, it's fine to say, okay, we want to see if we can push the unemployment rate down a little bit without inflation arising. But that's an experiment. And what you have to think about is, well, what if we do that and we're hit by a commodity price shock? Are we going to be more vulnerable in recovering from that? Are the inflation consequences going to be much larger? That's part of the cost of carrying out the experiment. And so I think you have to be, sort of think through those scenarios. You don't just want to say, let's use our existing models, no other shocks, we just kind of push the unemployment rate down, but you want to think about whether that makes us more vulnerable should some shocks arise. And pardon the reference to literature, but Elizabeth Gaskell, in her 1855 novel, North and South, which I'm sure everybody's read, reminds us that the storms we will face will come from unexpected directions. And I think that's really true. Nobody expected COVID, nobody expected the war in Ukraine. And so we have to think about, if what if we are hit by these things we hadn't expected? Do we think our framework is robust enough to help guide us in how we respond? Oh, and just Larry, so the 2020 statement does say average inflation targeting. So, but it also, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, Chris, I didn't respond to Chris.
Yeah.
Balance sheet policies are too complicated to deal with in it.
Okay. Hey, Ken, you want to offer some thoughts? No? Okay. Well, I'm going to do, okay, build out that, yes, there's a question.
I wonder if you could talk about not just the policy framework, but how it was actually operationalized, because you could have the framework and you could operationalize in a different way than the Fed actually did. If you remember, there were 3 conditions for liftoff, and there are some additional conditions added that we can't lift off until we've ended the QE, but we can't end QE abruptly. We have to taper it. You talked about how the monetary policy was operationalized and any changes that you would recommend in that sphere.
Yeah, that's.
So I didn't directly address that. I was looking at sort of the broader framework and thinking, my perspective is.
But you do sort of argue it wasn't much of a constraint.
Right.
That's what the literature says, that it was asymmetric, but it didn't seem to matter that much.
I think my sort of overarching concern is, will the public understand what the Fed is trying to do? Maybe it's hopeless. Yuri's evidence suggests it's hard to know what the public infers from things. How you operationalize it once you define these objectives, that's getting more into the nitty-gritty than I generally dealt with. So.
Yuri's papers on this are wonderful about how little the public understands, and how much it's like talking to your dog, and it's seeing your mood and not really knowing, they have no idea what you're saying.
Well, I think this is a great way of ending the session. So thank you so much, and thanks to 2 speakers for these great presentations.